Good evening. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here, and we are delighted to have you with us for Covert City with Vince Houghton and Eric Driggs. We're pretty excited to launch this book about the Cold War and the making of Miami, and these gentlemen are both Miami natives, so I think they're very invested in the topic. I'm hearing about singers who went to high school with them. I think we're going to get a lot of inside scoop on Miami. But beyond being Miami natives, I will first introduce Vince, who has the turquoise shirt on. He is the director of the National Cryptologic Museum at the National Security Agency, and some of you may know, he is the former historian and curator here at SPY. He is the author of Nuking the Moon and Nuclear Spies. He's joined by Eric in the gray shoes. We talked a lot about the gray shoes.
Just tell them prison shoes. We had this discussion earlier. I learned something today.
Eric is a congressional liaison for U.S. Southern Command. He is a Coast Guard Reserve officer with previous experience as the Governmental and External Affairs Officer for Coast Guard's 7th District and experience as a Cuba analyst at the University of Miami. This is going to be a conversation between these two Miami natives. And so, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eric and Vince.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. This is quite a culmination of a decades-long friendship. Eric and I have known each other for over 30 years.
You could have just said a long time. We would have been fine.
And we've been talking about this, writing this book together for the last 10, 15 years. And so kind of coming together finally, the culmination of tonight is really a treat for us, especially being able to do it here, which is my old stomping grounds. And it's just a blast to be here tonight. We kind of looked to write this book because we saw there was a glaring hole in the literature about the Cold War, and at the town we grew up in was the Hull. And what we wanted to do was to try to demonstrate, based on what we knew, that Miami should be considered as important a Cold War city as the ones we already consider, the Washingtons, the Moscows, the Berlins, the Beijings. And this just hadn't been written about before. I'm like, well, let's just do it ourselves, right? We couldn't find it anywhere else, so we decided to hunker down and do it ourselves. And then realizing also that our hometown, as glitzy and glamorous as it is today, not that long ago was a kind of a podunk little town that was just had very little going for it. And it really was national security and espionage. And the hundreds of millions of dollars that were dumped into Miami by CIA and others that turned it into the town we know today. And again, no one had written about that. And then when you find those wonderful holes in history, you kind of chuckle to yourselves and go, all right, we have a topic, we can talk about that, nobody else is. And that's what kind of led us to this point here today. Where we come from a Miami perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about this quickly first, because Eric's story is much more interesting than mine. I'm a 14th generation American. My earliest ancestor came over in the 1630s. As far as living in South Florida, my dad came over during World War II, went to Miami High School and graduated in 1957, joined the Navy, and then went to the University of Miami where he met my mom. It is as quintessential a white Miamian story as you're gonna get. Right, as nuts and bolts white population in Miami. Eric, on the other hand, has an extremely more interesting story about his family. And I think that, it really gives him the bona fides to write a book like this.
Oh, let's hope so. First of all, thank you guys all for coming. As you mentioned, this is something that's been at least germinating in our minds for a long time, and seeing it come to fruition is just an amazing experience, and you guys are a part of that, so thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Eric Driggs. I think if you asked AI to come up with a Cuban name and it spit my name out, you would probably be tinkering with it. Something's very, very wrong. Growing up in Miami, there were a bunch of kids like me whose parents came from Cuba, but their names were, Fernandez, Hernandez, Rodriguez. So I got used to kind of introducing myself as an undercover Cuban, which made sense in Miami. I learned that's probably not a good idea to introduce yourself here in Washington as an undercover Cuban. You kind of get a different reaction and maybe some friends you weren't expecting. But yeah, I mean, our family story, my grandfather, both sides are from Cuba. My grandfather was in the Cuban Navy. He rose to the rank of captain, and he was the director of the Cuban Naval Academy during World War II and again in the 1950s, which I think he's the only person to ever do that. I'm actually wearing a replica of the ring of the class he graduated in 1933. And I don't wear rings very often. I only really wear them when I'm doing something that I think my grandfather would get a kick out of, and I think this counts. So his story, it was 1957, and there was an uprising against Batista, who, as many of you know, was the dictator before Castro, and it took place on a naval base. He had nothing to do with it. He's not even really, he wasn't that political. In fact, I don't even think he was in the country at the time. But as you might imagine, facts are really not that important to police forces that are working under a dictatorship. So he was thrown in prison for a little bit and was given the option of either rescinding his position in the Navy and leaving the country, or basically rotting in prison. Very wise, chose option A. They moved to Miami, spent a little bit there, and then, lo and behold, January 1, 1959 happens, and they're like, hey, those bearded guys got rid of Batista, we can go back. And they did. And it quickly became clear that what the revolution said it was and what was manifesting on the island were two very different things. So they left shortly thereafter, never to return, unfortunately. My mom was an unaccompanied minor. We talk about this in the book. There was a program called Operation Peter Pan to get unaccompanied minors out of Cuba. My mom was one of those. She went from Havana to the bustling metropolis of Chadron, Nebraska. To this day, she talks about the kindness that the people of Chadron showed her. And once the rest of the family was able to come to the United States, she joined them. So that's kind of our background story. And fast forward to 2019, I move here to D.C. Vince is already here, working here, I believe, right? So we reconnect, and we're having dinner one day, and he's like, hey, remember that? Remember we were talking about like writing a book and all this stuff? I was like, yeah, that was kind of funny. He said, we should do it. We should do it. And lo and behold, here we are. And there's a question that I had always had, I never really asked you. You were already an accomplished author. What made you think like doing this with a co-author was a good idea?
Well, I'm a masochist, I think, for one. No, I mean, you're right, is that there's a very different universe when it comes to writing a book with someone else versus by yourself. You have to, there's a lot of compromise, there's a lot of communication that doesn't exist when you're doing, I'm an introvert, I don't really like people all that much, and so the idea of being able to write a book by myself is wonderful, but I think your story is the reason. You kind of buried the idea that your family might be the only people to leave Cuba twice, during this time period, one under Batista, one under Castro. And what's really extraordinary about Eric and I, like we talked about, we've known each other for a long, long time. You remember middle school, I actually met your brother, Alex, who's back over there.
Who's here, by the way?
At Howard Drive Elementary at Cosmos Center, which is the gifted program. He was a year older than me, Eric's a year younger, so we're talking elementary school. And so Eric and I went to the same schools, had the same friends, played the same sports, watched the same sports, went to the same church, all the same experiences, same teachers across the board. There's nothing we didn't do different, the same, and we grew up blocks from each other so we could walk to each other's houses. So all of our experiences were the same, but we viewed them through very different prisms. Right? From my background and my kind of upbringing were dramatically different than what happened in the Driggs household. And your parents were wonderful, and the fact is, they spoke English when I was there because they knew I knew about 9 words in Spanish, and they're all the bad words, which I still those are the 9 words I know. And we're very nice to do that, but you were a Cuban household. I mean, that you grew up with parents who had escaped dictatorship and all their land being and their freedoms being taken away from them. And I grew up in a, again, kind of silver spoony kind of situation. And so even though we had exactly the same upbringing, I mean, I even played in a band with his brother, Uncle Clem's favorite
Uncle
forever,
Clem's favorite. Shout out to Uncle Clem's favorite.
which was a very loud garage band with very limited talent. And, to this day, my neighbors, every time I go home, still go, at least you're not playing that garbage in your garage anymore. So that's how similar our upbringings were, but again, from a very different lens. And so writing about Miami, I think if I had written this by myself, it would have been a very different book. It would have been a book that probably would have made a lot of the Cuban exile community very angry at me, because of my perception is from my father's side, who, again, left for the Navy in 1957, came back to Miami in 1961. There is a very different experience in the Miami of 1957 and the Miami of 1961. And so from his perspective, I grew up as very much an outsider looking at the Cuban community. Eric, on the other hand, if he had written this book by himself, he probably would have made, the Miami New Times and the Miami Herald kind of chastise him for being so pro-exile. So kind of for these programs that we now look at as being somewhat pork barrel and other things like that. Because we've written this together, we're absolutely guaranteed to piss everybody off. And I think the nuance and the kind of how objective this book is really what makes it stand out. Because if there are books about Miami, Joan Didion wrote a book called Miami, which is really famous. A New Yorker parachuting into Miami, spending a couple months there and thinking she's an expert. Now, she's a wonderful writer, but her book was very much from the outsider perspective. It's probably what I would have written, very similar to that. But by bringing us together, there are times where our friendship was tested to a degree, where Eric was like, Vince, you can't write this. And I'm like, no, of course I can write this. This is actually what happened. He goes, you can't write this. My parents will disown you forever if you write this. But at the same time, it's not being fair. You're using hindsight. You're using your historical knowledge of this program not working. So you can call it pork all you want. You can say it was a waste of money. But I worked on this program. And I'm like, oh, shit. Sorry. I was, making fun of it, but let's take a step back and understand things. And then the reverse was true also, where Eric was like, I don't think people are going to like you referring to these particular people as terrorists. I'm like, they were. How else are we going to describe them? Right? He's like, well, I don't really feel like getting blown up myself. And I'm like, I get that. That's a problem.
That's not a quote.
Yeah.
This is a dramatization of
right.
the discussion that took place.
We're doing an interpretive dance of what actually happened. But there are times when I'm like, Eric, I understand that this is not kind of what you want to hear, but we're talking about objective reality here. And I think that was a back and forth that really made a difference to how we wrote this book. And the final thing I'll say, and I'm going to let Eric talk about this, is his research he did not only at the University of Miami, but because of his grandfather and because of the archives that he holds in his living room in a Tupperware container of all of his grandfather's papers, really provides him insight that I could never have gotten otherwise. And I really want to kind of kick this back to you to talk about your understanding of the different exile groups that landed in Miami, because I think there's a misunderstanding, even among people that grew up in Miami, that there was one just monolithic block of Cubans who came over because of Castro, and it's the opposite.
So just quickly about this huge Tupperware container. The house that I have in Miami was my grandfather's house that they settled into when they moved from Cuba. Our dad grew up there. My brother, my sister, and I would go there like every teacher workday and all the weekends and all this sort of thing. When he passed away, I took over the house. I was looking through some stuff, and I saw some documents. This is not like your typical grandfather reading material. There were amphibious operations manuals from the United States Marine Corps in 1961. There were kind of curious lists of names of boats. There were these letters. There was just a whole bunch of I'm no Sherlock Holmes, but I'm like, oh, this is curious. Something is amiss. And that kind of started, I think Vince and I had already kind of started about talking about this book, but coming across that, I'm like, oh, wait a second. Like there is an incredible history here that I'm actually still trying to piece some of this stuff together. But that was part of my piece, I think, of this book, was just uncovering some things that I don't know really have been written about before, or really thought of in certain ways. One of the things that I think Vince and I tried to do with this book is really kind of help the readers kind of connect dots in ways that haven't really been done before, you know? For instance, Miami itself as a city, it's kind of a strange place. And once you start connecting the dots of the formative experiences of the city, we're all products of our formative experiences, and communities are no different, right? And Miami is a pretty young city. I mean, I think they're celebrating the 100th anniversary next year. I think 1925 they were founded. So, a city that is just kind of coming into its own and finds itself at the doorstep of the largest ideological struggle on the planet, that's going to have an impact, and it did. So that's one of the dots that we were hoping to kind of help people see. Like what you're seeing in Miami these days, there's a very clear kind of story arc and a trajectory as to how the city got there. And I think the same is true of one of the main characters, in this drama, which is the Cuban exile community. I think a lot of people look at the Cuban exile community with curiosity, or just kind of like, why are they doing this? And once you understand their story, it makes a whole lot of sense. People, with very few exceptions, are rational. They're rational beings. The tricky part is figuring out what logic drives that rationality, and kind of their worldview and their truth. And once you figure that out, things become pretty simple, and things start making a lot of sense. The book starts with a brief discussion of kind of the center of the Cuban historical universe, Jose Marti, who is he is pretty much their George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and poet laureate all wrapped into one. And he spent a not insignificant period of time in the United States, organizing and coordinating for a conflict to basically overthrow the Spanish authorities in Cuba. He was working to basically send men, money, and materiel over to Cuba for the struggle for independence. So, and Martí is just like all of us. We grew up hearing about George Washington and all this sort of thing. They learned about Martí. So, years later, when a number of those people find themselves in the exact same situation in the United States with a government that they see as a foreign intercessor, it makes all the sense in the world that they did exactly the same thing that Martí did. Now, the execution probably left a lot to be desired, and the book is, we kind of have a little bit of fun with it. I remember I was in the Library of Congress, right, I don't know what direction it is, but here in Washington, which is one of the reading room is one of the most beautiful places in the city. If you haven't gone there, you must go there. I'm sitting there and I'm reading, there is a CIA manual that these poor guys were basically writing to try and get their arms around the exile explosion of organizations. And we're talking about, maybe in a matter of 3 years, we're talking over 400 organizations. And this is not a big community. So,
and every one of them has the same damn name.
And yes, and that's part of what
I'm reading through these, I'm like, this is ridiculous.
There's literally, I know there's a bunch of people in DOD and State Department probably in this room, and everyone has their acronyms. But at least they deconflict, and people have separate acronyms. There are like 7 or 8 that have the exact same acronym, and we have a little fun with it in the book. But it makes all the sense in the world that that's what they did, right?
There was nothing funnier than our poor copy editor who had to go through and check every single letter and because we had to fix it a couple times, because you'd write federation of this and that, and then you've got translated into Spanish, and our very non-Spanish fluent copy editor got into a email argument with me over something, because I'm texting with Eric, and I'm like, Eric says it's this way. He's like, well, I'm like, Eric is not only Cuban, but fluent. We're going to take Eric's word for it. But it was impossible. This is an impossible situation for this poor copy editor, because there were page after page of just names of these organizations. And to the point where he mentions the CIA had to put a manual out so that people could actually understand what they were looking at.
Yeah, so I mean, it's understandable, right? And it makes sense. It's logical. And the same could be said, years later when the Cuban community kind of coalesces politically and starts kind of influencing things in other ways. And I say that because in some ways the Cuban experience and the Cuban story in Miami is a quintessentially American immigrant story. And in some ways it is absolutely an exponential outlier. I don't know if there are any Malcolm Gladwell fans in here, but he talks about outliers and basically how people who we think are rich and famous because they work very hard and are smarter than all of us, once you kind of dig a little deeper, they also had some external factors that were huge opportunities that weren't available to others. And I think the Cuban community is a huge case study of that. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Within, I'd say, a year or two of the Cuban community being established in Miami, they had direct access to the President of the United States. I don't think that is your average immigrant story in the United States. And so it makes all the sense in the world, years later, when they decide to coalesce politically, that they do so, and that they are shooting for changing or influencing U.S. policy and the President of the United States. Why? Because they've already been in his office. They know it's possible, and they've been there before. So the last kind of dot connecting that I'll talk about that I think Vince already touched on is the idea that Miami is actually, it's worth discussing as one of the major nodes in the Cold War. Everybody knows about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, and the Bay of Pigs, and that's usually where it ends, which, by the way, are pretty significant in and of themselves. But the book kind of talks about some other pieces that I don't think very many people know about. There were clandestine maritime operations that were going from Miami into Cuba for years and years and years. And the vast majority of those operations were running men, money, and materiel into Cuba. Starting to sound familiar a little bit, right? The echoes of what they knew was what they executed. The other piece in Miami that I'd say, the Cold War was really fought differently in Miami than almost anywhere else. And one of the most effective weapons in that front of the Cold War was used exclusively by Fidel Castro. And it was the weapon of mass migration. And I don't think a lot of people know about the Mariel boat lift, and they know about a lot of the movements north from Cuba to the United States. But I don't think they realize that they were deliberately used as a weapon to impact, to influence, or to harm the United States, and particularly the city of Miami, because that was the biggest threat to the Cuban government. So that's part of what we're trying to do. Is just there are things that all of us know about in this room, but it's an attempt to help, or at least make the case to think about them differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think the weapons of mass migration thing is interesting because it's really about influence operations, information warfare, propaganda. It's Fidel Castro was able to use immigration as a way to mar the Cuban community in Miami, right? Mariel's a great example. If you've heard of the Mariel boat lift, even the Cuban community in Miami who came in the 50s and 60s looked down upon the Marielitos, the Mariel Cubans. And that is a perception that still exists to this day in Miami, is that, oh, it was all criminals and people who came out of insane asylums and all this. That was like 1% of the people, the thousands and thousands of people that came over during Mariel. But Castro was able to use that effectively to paint the entire community that came over in 1980. And it was done on purpose. This was not something that was accidentally done. You know, God forbid, and Eric would ever, as a Cuban, give praise to Fidel Castro, but I think you have to in this case. Castro was an expert, a genius at using immigration as a weapon, as an information warfare weapon, but also as a way to release pressure on his domestic policies, right? Whenever there are domestic problems inside Cuba, whenever people were starting to talk about the issues going on and they wanted better rights, they wanted more freedoms, fine, you don't want to be here? Go. They'll take you in Miami, and let me dump some more people on you that the people, the exile community and the U.S. government will have to take care of in Miami. And then Mariel is this genius move where he's like, you know what? Anyone who wants to leave can leave. You just got to get a ride, right? Mm-hmm. And so this flotilla of boats go from Miami, and anyone and everyone who wants to leave goes on, and he does, opens the prisons, and he opens the insane asylums. But there's a nuance behind that too, because people aren't in prison necessarily for robbing banks or for rape. They're in prison because they talk trash about the Cuban government. They're not in insane asylums because they're schizophrenic or they have multiple personalities. They're in insane asylum because you have to be crazy if you don't fully embrace Fidelism. So we're gonna commit you to an insane asylum. So, but Castro used that. He used that effectively to paint these Marielitos as this community of riffraff that were going to destroy Miami. And you can still see that impact today. Anyone seen Griselda, the Netflix special about Griselda Blanco? All right, well, she's not Cuban, but she was a drug kingpin in Miami right around when we were very young kids. And when the Marielitos came over, she brought along several of them as her guns, her hired guns. And they're like, all the Marielitos are here, and they all want to shoot everything up and make money for drug running. It's like, this show was made in 2024, and we're still having these conversations today. It's because of how effectively Fidel was able to do that.
I remember in college, one of my roommates, he was like, "Oh, you're Cuban, huh?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "I know 2 Cubans, Ricky Ricardo, Scarface." Yeah. So, yeah, our relationship blossomed from there. But this was, you know, obviously many years later, and I don't know if you all remember Scarface, but Tony Montana was a Marielito who came to the United States, and so he was a part of that. And it is unbelievably powerful, the whole Marielito thing. And one thing I just want to, because the whole criminal bit, I found very interesting and just fascinating because it was true that some of these folks were criminals. But as Vince mentioned, what we think of criminals and what's criminal in Cuba are 2 very different things. I don't know, I'm assuming some of you have seen Minority Report. The whole idea of, you know, if they like pre-crime, they can arrest you before you commit a crime because, you know, they have the technology or something. In Cuba, for many, many, many years, I think it was repealed, I don't know, a couple of years ago, there was a law called the Law of Dangerousness, which basically meant if the government deemed you someone capable of committing a crime, they could put you behind bars. And that story of the Marielitos was never really told. That no one really asked questions as to, okay, even if they were in prison, what were they in prison for? But an absolute masterstroke. Fidel was a lot of things that I can't mention in a public space, but he was a political master, a Machiavellian genius, and unfortunately, his use of his own people as a weapon was very well utilized, and really very unique, I think, to the Miami front of the Cold War. I don't know that you see that very many places.
What's really interesting about the city itself, and we talked about the idea that national security and intelligence builds Miami. Let me be more specific. The CIA station in Miami, when the Castro Revolution takes place, January 1st, 1959, had a grand total of one person working at it. One individual working for the CIA down in Miami. And his job was to interview the exiles leaving from Cuba to try to get, we call open source information about kind of what was happening in the news, what was going on, what was the chatter on the streets. So this one individual had a lot to do. He actually put his number in the phone book, the Miami phone book. He had business cards with his home number written on it and handed them out to anyone who would listen.
What was he listed as?
As CIA. He straight up said, I'm Justin Gleichoff, I work for the CIA.
Smooth.
Yeah.
Very smooth.
Yes. Yeah, not so clandestine. It was kind of like when James Bond walks in and says, Bond, James Bond. So his job was essentially to just gather. The U.S. government didn't care at this point. But Castro was not seen as a threat. We actually didn't even know Castro was going to be leaning so far to the left that he was going to be cozying up with the Soviets. Some people did. Raul Castro certainly did, and Che Guevara did, because they were already on their way to the Soviet Union. But Fidel was still not seen as a threat, as a communist. So Justin Gleichoff sat down there and just kind of interviewed people and said, I'm kind of getting overwhelmed here. Can you give me some help? And so they did. The CIA beefed his unit up by 400%, gave him 3 extra guys. Fortunately, they all spoke Spanish, so you could actually Justin didn't, so you could have these conversations. The big problem was there were 17 different agencies who were in charge of interviewing immigrants when they came over from Cuba. Everybody from Customs to Border Patrol to the FDA, because of people were bringing fruits and vegetables from Cuba. So obviously the FBI. Was that?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. And so he was like, who's in charge of this? And especially as Castro begins to lean a little bit more toward cozying up to the Soviets, it became a bigger issue. Now, let me contrast that with 1961, 2 years later. The CIA is now 1/3 of Miami's economy by 1961. Let me say that again. It is a city of 1 million people, and the CIA is providing 1/3 of the economy. The CIA station in Miami is the second largest CIA station in the world. Only Langley, Virginia, the headquarters of the CIA, has more personnel than Miami. The Miami station is bigger than the Moscow station, bigger than the Berlin station, and bigger than the Saigon station. You can think about that in the 1960s. It has hundreds of CIA personnel on payroll and thousands, if not tens of thousands of Cubans who are being paid as part of the CIA mission in Miami. It was the second largest employer in the state of Florida. Let's sink in, like not Disney, it was the CIA. Now, what was happening, right? This isn't just about people, because the 400 or so CIA personnel and the 15,000 or so Cubans needed to buy houses, cars, furniture, food. They went to the movies, they went to the malls to buy clothes. All this just dumps hundreds of millions of dollars into the Miami economy, all on our dime, on the taxpayer dime, because of the CIA. There were 4 people on the CIA staff whose job it was just to do real estate transactions, to buy land out in the Everglades for training facilities, to buy safe houses and sell them and rotate safe houses so you can have people coming in and leaving and going during that time. That transforms Miami like no other. I mean, again, 1/3 of the economy, that is adding billions of dollars to the local economy during a time of not decades, of years, and only a couple of them. And what's fascinating about this is that none of it really works. The Bay of Pigs is a failure, as you know. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't because of the CIA presence in Miami. We now know a lot more about it was DIA and NSA and overflights with U-2. And then the operations that follow that, like Operation Mongoose and other things, which have part of CIA lore, essentially do very little, do next to nothing. The truth of the matter is the most effective intelligence agency in Miami was not the CIA. The most effective intelligence agency in Miami was the DGI, which is Cuban intelligence. Pound for pound, Fidel Castro's intelligence agency was the best in the world. And it's not me saying that. The CIA and the FBI say that too. And forget the pound for pound part. The Directorate of Intelligence, which is now called it used to be the DGI, now it's the Director of Intelligence, is arguably one of the top 5 intelligence agencies in the world. And I don't mean just for their size, I mean regardless of size. They're exceptionally good. Let me give you an example. In 1987, we got a defector who defected from Cuba to the United States. And he was very high up in Cuban intelligence. And he told us something that blew everyone's mind. From 1964 to 1987, so for over 20 years, not a single CIA asset in Cuba was actually working for us. Dozens and dozens and dozens of people we thought we had recruited inside Cuba to spy on the Castro regime had been doubled back against us. Every single one. We did not have a single asset working for us in Cuba. In fact, most of them were spreading disinformation. A lot of the reason, and we can talk about this, that we thought Castro kept dying. We actually have a chapter to the book called Schrodinger's Castro because of all the different times when everyone thought Castro was dead. A lot of the disinformation was fed to us, and they ate our lunch. I mean, we fortunately caught people in the WASP network, people like Ana Montez, but for everyone we caught, there's probably 50 that we didn't. And a conservative estimate, especially with Mariel, a conservative estimate is 1 out of every 15 or 1 out of every 20 Cuban exiles included a Cuban intelligence officer. Why not, right? It's the wonderful thing that the Cuban exile community is, how welcoming it is to new exiles, how much they want to set you up and make sure that you have a job and you have a community, is the downfall, right? It makes it the easiest infiltration in the world, right? You come over on a raft, you have a sob story, you're leaving Castro's, the repression of the Castro government. Little Havana takes you in, they set you up with a job, you eventually work into some of the exile community organizations like Brothers of the Rescue and other things, working the whole time for Cuban intelligence. And it's still to this day a problem. We keep catching Cuban spies, including former ambassadors who were spying for the Cubans who were just arrested 2 weeks ago. It's a really, we have this undercurrent throughout the book of it's a real interesting spy story. And you don't see that in any other city in the country. It's just not, Washington, D.C. maybe, but other than D.C., you don't have these stories coming out of Seattle or Denver, right? There aren't spy stories coming out of Dallas. No, it's Miami. All right, it got to the point where we had to cut ourselves off. We said nothing that happens after this point will end up in the book because we'd still be writing, right? Because every single time we thought we were turning it in, there was another story, whether it was a coup in Haiti or an attempted coup in Venezuela or a Mexican national arrested in Miami for spying for the Russians. Every single time, the original report didn't have anything to say about Miami, but I text Eric, I'm like, $10. In 2 days, we're going to find out there's a Miami story.
We literally were texting back and forth. We're like, oh, there was a coup in Haiti? $10, it was organized in Miami.
And then 2 days later,
Bing!
Organized on Brickell Avenue in Miami in a high-rise.
Yeah.
The attempted coup in Venezuela.
A bunch of guys in a Zodiac and 12 rifles going to overthrow a government. That sounds very, very Miami.
Sounds very
and
Miami.
Sure enough, Miami.
And so we got to the point where we had to tell the publisher, like, this is it. Because our editor kept sending us, like, did you see this? I'm like, yeah, we saw this, but we can't keep writing this stuff. And that's the city, and that's the trick that separates Miami from everywhere else, is that when the Cold War ended in 1989 or 91 or whatever date you want to use for the end of the Cold War, it ended everywhere but one place, Miami, Florida. Because we're still fighting it today. Right? The Cold War doesn't end in Miami, and that's the one really cool thing as a historian to look at, where you're still living this stuff.
Yeah, not so cool from over here, but yeah.
Well, yeah, South Common, Coast Guard.
I'm talking about like my family and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
All right,
those two, maybe.
See, that's why we work together. We're a perfect pair.
He's like, this is awesome.
I'm
Wow,
like, so
what an amazing.
fascinating. You're like, yeah, my family doesn't have a home.
Not great. Yeah, this book, it's interesting because it is a history book. It's very personal for me. In there are some pieces where I'm writing about it. I'm like, oh my God, it triggered memories that I had totally forgotten about. Vince was talking about how the Cold War ended everywhere else, and I remember, we're still kids, but the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that's in the book, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and incredibly, David Hasselhoff is part of one of the most incredible moments in world history. The New Year's Eve party on the Berlin Wall, there's actually David Hasselhoff. He's in there. So the rest of the world is ecstatic, right? And Cuba is waiting. And Miami is hoping, right? And they're kind of excited. They're like, okay, this is good. Things are happening, right? Then you see all these revolutions around Europe and the dismantling of the Soviet Union. And people are talking about the end of history and talking about the sweeping of democracy all over the world. And Miami is still waiting. And there's a part in the book, and I'll never forget this. There's a song that is, I mentioned it in the book. It's by a guy named Willie Chirino, who...
It's part of the playlist, by the way.
Oh, it is?
We were just in the
awesome.
green
Oh,
room.
maybe we can fire it up. If not...
it's 14 minutes long.
He's...
Yeah.
This is what I've had to deal with writing this book. It's a great song. He was another Pedro Pan. He was an unaccompanied minor. He ended up in Miami, and he's he's like the bard of the Cuban exile experience. And he wrote a song around that time, 92, 93. And it talks about his experience leaving Cuba as a child and the exile experience and all this stuff. And but it was written in 92, 93. So the song is called Ya Viene Llegando, which means kind of it's coming, our time is coming, right? And towards the end of the song, he basically lists all of the countries that have recently been freed. And it ends with Cuba. Ends with them saying, Cuba and whatever, and everyone's all excited. And I remember my dad, and he was listening to this song, and this is in the book, but this is kind of the counterplay of the military historian and the whatever I am, which I'll get to in a second. I think I figured out what I am. He's just staring into I'm not sure, I've never seen that face on him before or since. And I knew where he was, I think he was kind of daring to dream that this time could be different, because there were so many times where, Fidel's dying or something's changing, and I never saw that face again. And so that's kind of the other side of this story. But this, I have to bring this up because we were joking about this. We were chuckling about it the other day. Reviews are starting to come in about this book, and one of them that's out there, it characterizes the book as the story of Miami as told by spies. And then the first couple sentences, it says, well, there's a military historian and a spy. And I'm like, okay, well, I know he's a military historian. So...
everyone's like, yeah, you work for the Coast Guard.
Right,
Sure
yeah,
you do,
exactly.
pal.
I clearly would be the worst spy in the history of the world if that were the case, because, he'd peg me from a mile away.
So we'll start taking questions in a second, so if you have one, you can line up. But I just want to highlight one final thing about the relationship of writing this book. Eric wrote the epilogue, I wrote the foreword. And if you want to get an idea of who we are as people and how we approach this, reading those two things is a great way. So the epilogue is heartfelt, it's poetic, it's about his family, it's about looking to the future, it's about hope, it's about all these wonderful things that Eric encompasses as the son of a Cuban exile family. The prologue is about how pissed I was that I wasn't in Miami when Castro died because I missed the party. And I'm still pissed off I missed the party. And so that gives a little bit of an idea.
It was pretty good.
It's
Fair enough.
The one Thanksgiving I don't go home, it's like, what could possibly happen? And Castro dies on Black Friday. And so that's kind of the approach we took to this of, I am the kind of outsider who was, I'm a native, but this story is really about the Cuban diaspora. It's really about the idea of a country that lost its country, right? It's really hard for me to, and I've learned a lot kind of talking to Eric about this, to overstate how difficult it is to be empathetic in the way you need to be to understand the Cuban exile community. Because it's so easy from the outside to look at some of these programs, or look at Elian Gonzalez, or look at some of these stories and to be just mocking and just being like, God, these guys are wackadoodles, right? These, they're running around. I mean, there's still there's organizations that still exist they're now 85-year-old men running around the Everglades blowing stuff up and shooting things, because one day they're going to go back into Havana on their walkers, doing that. So there are those elements, but the vast majority of the people who are living down there now and look at Cuba as an aspirational thing, even to this day.
Oh,
and I think that, when Castro died, my first thought, and I say this in the book, my first thought was, I'm going to miss the party. But my second thought was, are all my friends going to leave now? Because I grew up and 50% of my friends were kids of Cuban exiles, and their family, the word of the message of the 80s and of the 90s was, when Castro's gone, we can go take back what we lost. We can finally go get what was taken away from us. And Castro was dead, but it was 2016. And by that point, Castro didn't matter anymore, right? Because he had passed along his power to his brother. And it wasn't about a person anymore. It was about, we had an argument, what do we call it? Do we call it Castroism or Fidelism? But it was an ideology that had lived on, and it didn't just live on in Cuba. It was now in places like Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and Colombia, and other places. Some of it's been pushed back, right? Colombia is doing better than it was, when there was a lot of issues going on. But Venezuela is still Venezuela. Bolivia is kind of teetering. Some of these countries, Nicaragua, right? Some of these countries don't need a Fidel Castro because they have the ideology that's still there. And that's really something that was eye-opening to me, because I just completely dismissed that as a possibility. Even though I'm a historian of the Cold War, to me it was Fidel or nothing, and it didn't matter at this point anymore. Him dying didn't make all that much of a difference.
No, yeah, we're also kind of Star Wars geeks, so we talk about Miami as kind of like Mos Eisley Cantina, right? It's kind of the sketchy place now where if you want, you need a gun runner or you need to shoot first, this is where you go. And hopefully that end piece, or where we are now, makes sense, right? After reading the book, that this story arc kind of makes sense. And keeping with the Star Wars geekiness, the issue of Fidel Castro and him being immaterial, it kind of strikes me a little bit like the moment when Darth Vader kills Obi-Wan, and he's like, "If you strike me down, I'll be more powerful than you could possibly imagine." I'm getting blank stares, so I guess this is a Star Trek crowd. I don't know. But he, he died as a very old man, and he had already ceded power. But say again. Should have done this on May 4th. I know. Oh, man, well, maybe we'll be back.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Fidel Castro. There were just there were so many times when I think his passing would have been consequential.
Yeah.
I remember I was working at the University of Miami, the Institute for Cuban Studies, and 2 doors down from me was the former CIA chief for the Caribbean, who will absolutely back up what Vince said about how the Cubans just running circles around us in terms of intelligence and that sort of thing. And he lived it. I mean,
Well, he'll back that up because we praise him in the book and say that he's the most important person you should turn to for this. And we kiss his ass a little bit, but yes.
There's that.
Anyway, continue. Sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I remember working there when, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, where there's these constant waves of, oh, maybe this time will be real, maybe this time will be real, and then people get, But I remember there was one where he actually had abdominal surgery, and it looked like this was going to be the one. And the city, it's hard to explain what the city felt like. There was just this electricity of just anticipation, right? which was very different than when it actually came to pass because he had become a non-factor. But yeah, he still his legacy lives on and is something that's impacting the region to this day. But the interesting part, I think, Vince talked about how if you're a fan of the Cold War, you really have to go to Miami because it really is the only place that it's still going on. The dynamic hasn't really changed, right? Cuba still sees the United States, and I think with good reason. I don't think I would disagree with him. The most existential threat to Cuba is the United States, and the center of gravity of that threat, without any question, is Miami, Florida. So, again, talking about how people being rational actors, right? Cuba has an exceptional intelligence agency. They put the bulk of that against the center of gravity of their greatest threat, which happens to be Miami, Florida, which is part of why I wrote this book.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Do you have anything else you want to?
I think we can go to questions, but we can end with one of my favorite sayings about Miami. Is what makes Miami so great is how close it is to the United States. And that really comes through in this. It's another world. It's something you really can't understand unless you experience and we grew up at a time when everyone's like, oh, it's a melting pot. It wasn't. In the 1980s, you had like 4 different cultural groups. You had the white Miami, you had the black Miami, you had the Cuban Miami, and then you had a Haitian population that had started to come over. Today, it is absolutely a melting pot. I think Cuban Americans make up less than 50% of Hispanics in Miami now, in Dade County.
I think that's true.
They're still by far the biggest block, but now you have so much immigration coming from South and Central America that it's made it, I think it's 49% of the Hispanics in Miami are Cuban, the other 51% are everybody else. And then you've got the usual suspects of the riffraff. The Russians have moved in to Miami, especially Sunny Isles, which is now called Little Moscow. And if you want to talk about anchor babies, they're coming here and having kids. And, the big thing about, political, people are coming here and getting citizenship. Well, they are, right? The Russian oligarchs' kids who are being born in the United States going back to Russia with a U.S. citizenship and a U.S. passport. There are very nervous people in our counterintelligence now thinking about 20 years when these people can waltz over here with a U.S. passport and all the protections it provides them. Not so worried about anchor babies from Guatemala, but anchor babies from Moscow is a big issue. And so Miami has become, like we talked about, the Mos Eisley Cantina. New York Times called Miami Casablanca back in the 1960s because it was like this haven of spies. That's way too poetic for what the city is today. And that's why we really kind of look at it as, this hive of scum and villainy. If you need money laundering, we got you. If you need to take out a government somewhere, Brickell Avenue, a high-rise building, you can find somebody to do it for you. That is all the current situation in the city today. And it's because we are still fighting the Cold War. And the one place on earth we're still fighting the Cold War is this city down in South Florida. And so the book, to us, we were fascinated by. What was the biggest surprise you ran into?
Oh man, there were a lot. I will say one of the things that really, really shocked me, I think, and I think I'm right, and I'm just amazed that it never came up. Everyone knows about the Bay of Pigs, correct?
Oh, this is go ahead.
I still can't believe this. I remember wondering, why the hell is it called the Bay of Pigs? What a stupid name. It's a body of water. Like, what's that all about? In Spanish, it's called Bahía de Cochinos. The direct translation is Bay of Pigs. And so I was doing some research. I was, Googling Bahía de Cochinos. And it turns out that the Bahía de Cochinos is in a part of Cuba. They have a number of coral reefs. And there is a fish called the triggerfish. That's a beautiful, it's like blue and yellow striped fish or whatever. It lives in coral reefs. The Cuban slang term for a triggerfish is a cochino. So I think we should have been talking about the Battle of Triggerfish Bay all along. I don't know if I'm right, but I really, really think I am, because Pig Bay just doesn't make any sense. So I think I'm onto something, and I think that was probably one of my biggest.
There is a South Florida town that translates to rat mouth. So
that is true.
Boca Raton, but
That is true.
so who knows?
Yeah.
Let me ask you one last question. There's a Florida man meme you may be familiar with. All right. There's also a meme because Miami, and it's kind of just your answer to questions like, why the hell are they doing that? And it's because Miami. It's just you understand that it's the city, it's nutty because Miami. I want to ask you, what is the most Miami thing you ran into during your research? Like what could only happen there?
I have two quick ones. One is like I came through my research, and one is one that I've known for a very long time. In my research, I had no idea that there was a fair amount of bomb throwing going on in Miami, and it's in the book. There's a guy who started an organization called Poder Cubano, Cuban Power, and this cat held a press conference. They blindfolded the reporters. They brought them into this room, and they sit them down. And there is a guy behind a table with like a bed sheet over him, so that he couldn't be identified. There are very many ways to hide your identity. I don't know why he chose. He didn't say a word. He like pointed to some documents that they thoughtfully printed out for them, and then they asked him to leave. And the only thing he kind of yelled something at the end about free Cuba, and that is so super Miami. Like that's just an incredibly Miami moment.
It would have been better if he was like, my name is Gorlando Posh.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
His name was Orlando Bosch. He's one of these, but yes. Anyway,
he's a notorious figure.
Yes.
The other Miami moment, I think, is one that I've heard from since I was a kid. And I told you my grandfather was a captain in the Cuban Navy and the director of the Naval Academy. And he, like just about every other immigrant, came to the United States and had to start over. And my dad told me this story because I think he was helping him out. They were trying to make ends meet, and one of the only things they could do was cut grass. So they started this landscaping company, and I use company loosely. And so he started knocking on doors and seeing if anybody wanted their lawn cut. He knocks on the door, he opens it, and this guy sees my grandfather, and he just bursts into tears. And it turns out that he was one of the midshipmen at the academy, and he remembers my grandfather. He had a spectacular mustache. I found out years later that the midshipmen would call him bigote, or mustache. So he recognized him immediately, and it was just a really my dad was probably 15, and he still remembers it. And that to me is a very, very Miami moment too, because it just kind of tells you, like, we're talking about, espionage and skullduggery and tomfoolery and all kinds of stuff going on. But in the end, this is all about people and all about kind of experiences, and that's my grandfather's story, I'm sure, was replicated all over the city and all over the country and all over the world. So, but that's, I would say that's.
So Eric gives the poignant story. I'll give the ridiculous one. My dad tells a story of his old college roommate who had graduated before him. Car had broken down or wasn't working and needed a ride to work. So my dad drives him. He's like, "Where am I taking you?" He's like, "I'll guide you in. I'll give you directions." So they're leaving the University of Miami area, driving south on US 1, turn right by where the Miami Zoo is, the Zoo Miami is today, and his friend is like, "Turn left here," whatever. Dad pulls up to the gate. It's a company, Zenith Technical Enterprises, and my dad turns to his friend and goes, "I didn't know you worked for the CIA." And his friend goes, "I don't know, what do you mean? This isn't the CIA." And it's like, everyone knows that this is the CIA. The only people in Miami that didn't know that everyone knew that the CIA station was the CIA station were the people that worked at the CIA station. And they were completely oblivious to the fact that it was the worst kept secret in Miami. And then eventually it comes out in an article. So there's an article that's written that outs the CIA station. Zenith Technical Industries is actually the CIA. It's University of Miami loaned them the land. It was University of Miami South. So UM just like, well, we didn't know they were there. We didn't know they were the CIA. So instead of the CIA leaving, they changed their name to Melmar Corporation. Just changed the name on the wall. Oh, we're not the CIA anymore.
Nothing to see here, folks.
Yeah, right. It's just the little glasses. And then what was funny is we found in the documents, they had all these front companies all over Miami, and every single one of them was like Acme Incorporated. There was all these ridiculous names.
Oh, Red Sunset Enterprises.
Yes, that
I
was
love
another-
that one. If
yeah.
you think about it, I'm like, okay, okay.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
So that was about as Miami as it gets. And you still, I think the story of the, I need to look this up and remember it for the next time we talk about this, but the company that was created by this former U.S. military guy who now is a contractor who contracted the fighting force that just tried to go into Venezuela about a year and a half ago, had some ridiculous name that was very appropriate to, this, some name that was like Bridge Builder Incorporated, whatever. But that's very much a South Florida thing.
Well, thank you, Eric and Vince, for an incredible conversation. I feel like we're all going to want to rush out and buy the book, which conveniently is for sale right outside. And Eric and Vince will be signing copies. As many as you buy, you'll sign them all, I'm sure, and other books by Vince if you want to buy one of those as well. So I want to thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, guys.